Hi everyone, welcome back to the second part of lecture for chapter 1. The next question we're going to try to answer is, why is each point on the earth unique? For example, you have the country of Singapore, which is very densely populated, it's rainy, it's wealthy, it's predominantly Buddhist and ethnically Chinese, it is diverse, it is developed, it is coastal, it is flat, it is post-industrial, meaning that has entered more of a service economy, which we'll learn more about later, and it is relatively healthy. Compared to a country like Lesotho, which is very sparsely populated, it is dry, it is poor, it is predominantly Christian, it is ethnically Soto, it is homogeneous, it is underdeveloped, it is landlocked, it is mountainous, it is pastoral, and it has higher rates of disease. And so we're going to look at some of the factors that go into this semester, why we have countries that are so very different, or points on the earth that are so very unique. We're also going to look a lot at culture. Culture is learned collective behavior, and it is rooted in geography and in your place. If you've ever traveled internationally, you know that you can travel somewhere and the culture and the practices can feel very different and feel very foreign to you. They include things such as your ethnicity and nationality, your economics, such as here is Lesotho again, which has a very rural economy. Language, there's a sign from the National Museum of Ethiopia. On the top there is Amharic. There's English below. And then food, such as these very unique eggs in Taiwan. Culture is dynamic. It moves around and it is constantly changing. And we'll talk about, next we're going to talk about in a minute, different types of diffusion and the ways that culture moves and changes. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is place, which I mentioned in the first part. People have a sense of place, and this is kind of a qualitative description of that place. Here's a sidewalk in Georgetown, Malaysia, and you can imagine if you were standing on that sidewalk, it looks very different than probably most sidewalks in the United States. It probably sounds very different, probably smells very different. Sense of place, one of the things that really much goes into sense of place is smell. I've traveled quite a bit in my life, and sometimes I will smell something cooking and be immediately taken back to some place that I've traveled to. Your sense of place is kind of determined by many variables, and the way that we experience place is subjective. And what I mean by that, based upon our background, we experience place in very different ways. Here is a mental map. A mental map, which you're going to be doing for your second exercise, is basically a map that you make by memory of an area or a place. And so here is a mental map of San Francisco. And you can see the Bay Bridge, the Presidio, there's a bike path in there. This is a mental map that was made by somebody who is fairly affluent and can travel around quite a bit. In the bottom there are some question marks. That is a low-income neighborhood, or a traditionally low-income neighborhood, that this person who drew it's like, I don't really know much about that area, but I can draw some of the more affluent areas pretty darn well. As opposed to this map, which is made by a low-income child in Austin, his entire world is about a block, a lot different, has a lot less mobility. And so our experience of a place is based upon our age and our race and our sex and our sexuality, our language, our religion, our ethnicity, our class. Are we considered more upper class? Our ability or our disability, etc., etc. Many, many things. For example, I was raised Catholic. If I step into a Catholic church, my experience of that place is going to be different from somebody who spent no time in Catholic churches, right? I'm immediately going to kind of be taken back to my childhood and kind of know my way around this place. So for your next exercise, you are going to create this mental map of a place, which I will give you more details on that when the exercise comes. And I want you to understand that your experience of place is often based upon inequality, right? So again, when we look at that child's drawing, he is not really leaving that immediate circle around his house. Uh, his understanding of the world and the availability of the world around him is much smaller than somebody who's affluent, who's from San Francisco. We're also going to talk about scale of culture. So culture is practiced in geographic areas of differing sizes, right? And so we have this scale that goes from the local to the global. So for example, here is a California burrito, which I'm sure many of you have eaten. California burrito is a uniquely Southern California phenomenon where you take this carne asada burrito and you stuff it full of French fries, right? We have taken this, quote unquote Mexican food. We have put a twist on it. We do this all the time with food. Food is such a great example of this. Um, and, I did not know about California burritos before I moved to San Diego. And most of my friends who do not live in San Diego do not know about the California burrito. Um, but then you look at kind of a global influence of food. Here's McDonald's in San Diego, right? McDonald's is just about everywhere. But even McDonald's is kind of subject to this scale of culture. Here is a McDonald's in Taiwan, and a McDonald's in Taiwan is going to have very different food than a McDonald's in San Diego. There's going to be some similarities, but basically that culture is going to take that global phenomenon and it's going to change it slightly. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Regions are ways of defining this scale of culture, right? So um, if you take a world regional class, we're talking about very large regions, but we can talk about much smaller regions as well. And there are three types of regions that we use to talk about this scale of culture. The first one is a formal region or a uniform one. So here's the Korean Peninsula. Um, it has a common characteristic throughout, which is the Korean language, right? So North and South Korea, which have been in the news a lot lately, are very, very different countries, but they all kind of have some cultural aspects in common. Then there is a functional region, which is focused on a node or a center. If we look at um, a map of the Seoul metro system in South Korea, right, that region is based upon a function. This is where the subway operates. So that is a region. And then we have a vernacular region, which kind of has undefined boundaries. So this is Gangnam, which it basically means south of the river. In Seoul, lots of places are south of the river that aren't considered part of this region, but people in their mind have a very specific idea of what this means and what this location is. It has more undefined boundaries. So if you want to think about things like the Midwest or the South in the United States, um, right, these have kind of these undefined boundaries, although some people will argue that they have more defined boundaries, but we all kind of have an idea in our brain of where this is. We also want to think about site and situation. So site is the geography of a place. So here is New York City. It is a city on a sheltered harbor. San Diego is also a city on a sheltered harbor. But New York City became a much more prominent port than San Diego did. And so we want to think about, despite the fact that they are both a city on a sheltered harbor, why did New York City become such a more of a major shipping area than San Diego did? And so for that, we want to look at situation, which is the geographic context of a place. How is it connected to other places? And so for New York City was connected to the Hudson by the Erie Canal and then became a major shipping lane up the Erie Canal um, to the Great Lakes region. So this is New York City's, not just its site, but its situation. The next question we want to answer is why are different places similar, right? What are the connections between these different spaces and places? So here is a bag of chips that's available at a 7-Eleven in Hong Kong. There's a lot going on here. First of all, they're potato chips. in Hong Kong. Second of all, they're part of the European series, and they're borscht flavored. Potato chips are a great example of this. If you ever travel internationally and you look at the flavors available of potato chips, um, you could see these different connections between these places, right? But you have a lot of Europeans living in Hong Kong, right? So you have this European series of borscht flavored potato chips. And so we're going to look at diffusion, which is that movement of cultural practices, which happens in a few different ways. The first is relocation, and that is just people move and they bring their culture with them, right? This is kind of the most straightforward way that diffusion happens, right? If you were to up and move tomorrow to another country, you're going to continue your cultural practices in that new country, right? So here is an example. Here's a Chinese Vietnamese restaurant in San Diego. People from this region moved to San Diego, and now they are continuing cooking their food. Again, food is a great example of this. And then there is expansion, where practices are spread to other people, and this happens in a few different ways. The first is hierarchical, which basically means it goes from node to node, um, usually from urban areas to urban areas, um, basically, and then spreading to more suburban and then to more rural areas. A great example of this is hip hop, which I'll show a picture of in a second. The next is contagious diffusion, which is diffusion outward from a point of origin. And an example of that would be Walmart, which my animation started. There you go. There is the first store, and then there's existing stores, and then there's new stores, right? Walmart spread by contagious diffusion from somewhere out. And so very often things are spread in multiple ways, where somebody can relocate and then it can spread by contagious diffusion, which I'll talk about in a second. And then there's stimulus diffusion, where the underlying principles diffuse, even though the practice doesn't diffuse fully. So basically, culture is diffused through a filter. Like I said before, culture can be diffused, but then often where it's diffused to will put its own twist or spin on it. So here's an example of a Vietnamese sandwich shop. Vietnamese sandwich shops, the Vietnamese sandwich is called banh mi, and banh mi is if you've never had banh mi, first of all, go have banh mi. It's delicious. Second of all, banh mi is basically this delicious Vietnamese sandwich that's on this French baguette. And the reason it's on this French baguette is because France colonized Vietnam, brought with them this baguette, and then the Vietnamese people took this baguette and made it into something unique. So first you have relocation, right, where you have the French relocating to Vietnam. You have stimulus, where you have the Vietnamese taking this this uniquely French thing and putting a twist on it. Then you have these Vietnamese people relocating to San Diego. And then banh mi, you're mostly going to find banh mi in the cities, right? So it's kind of spread through relocation and hierarchical diffusion at the same time. It's going to spread from urban center to urban center, and then likely eventually outward through contagious diffusion. We also want to think about globalization, which I'm sure is a word that you've heard before, but this is basically the idea that the world is becoming smaller and more interconnected. This is especially true with the dawn of the internet. This is true economically. So you have a company like the North Face that makes clothing and outdoor gear, which is able to operate globally, right? It has its headquarters in the United States, but it has distribution centers all over the United States, which is mainly where it's selling its product. It has another headquarters in Hong Kong, and then it has manufacturing sites throughout Europe, Asia, and South America. Also, culturally, here is a snowy mountain beer in Taiwan. It might look a lot like a bush beer because it is. Basically, this type of lager beer has been kind of marketed around the world, often very successfully by some American companies. And so Bush Beer went to Taiwan, rebranded itself as Snowy Beer, or Snowy Mountain Beer, excuse me. And so people worry about with globalization, is there this convergence towards a single global culture? This is especially true with the influence of American culture. You have cultures that are worried about this kind of Americanization of their culture, and that we're going to lose our cultural uniqueness. Um, but that is kind of a simplification, is more that elements of culture kind of disappear through generations. This happens in places that aren't necessarily as affected by globalization as well. So here we have, languages that are dying out where the last two speakers aren't talking, um, right? You have less and less people speaking this language. But the one thing I want you to understand is that globalization is uneven. Some people are more affected by it than others. Globalization is driven by a few things. Transportation. Here is a animation of airline traffic over a 24-hour period. Give you an idea of just how many planes are flying around the world at any given time. Communications. Here's a map of Facebook connections. And trade. Organizations like the World Trade Organization that are facilitating trade back and forth between countries. And again, when you look at these maps, I want you to note the unevenness, right? Not all places on the planet are well connected by the internet or by airline travel. Not all places have equal power in the World Trade Organization. And so what often happens is something called glocalization, which is where you have locally variants on globally popular culture. So here is that hip hop that has spread to Japan, right? And now you have Japanese hip hop. And this happens from that stimulus diffusion again. So you can see a McDonald's in the bottom right, right? Um, from India, there's no beef happening there, right? It's the McVeggie sandwich. There is the filet of fish, um, a paneer salsa wrap. And then The Simpsons, in a country that is predominantly Muslim, Homer Simpson is not going to drink alcohol, he is going to drink soda. So this is not just from America to the rest of the world, but this also goes from the rest of the world to America. So here is the California roll, which you can buy at a sushi restaurant. This is a uniquely American twist on sushi. Generally speaking, you're not going to find a California roll in Japan, this idea of this crab salad and avocado put inside of a sushi roll. And for our last question, we want to know, why are some human actions not sustainable, right? So here on the bottom, we have smog from fossil fuel combustion in Santiago, Chile, versus hydroelectric power in Oregon. So there are some reasons why some human practices are more sustainable than others. There have been a few different theories of human nature interactions. Um, an old one being environmental determinism, which we do not use anymore. The idea of environmental determinism is basically that your entire trajectory as a culture is determined by your environment. So your physical geography determines your cultural outcomes. And this has an ugly history of basically talking about different societies as fairly primitive based upon where they exist. Or the idea that Finland could have this international company, Nokia, because they were someplace cold and had to be innovative and therefore advanced, um, which is actually not true, right? There are a lot of reasons why Europe got an economic advantage, but now Finland has been able to take advantage of this economic advantage. Instead, we like to think about possibilism, where you have social conditions that determine different cultural outcomes, right? So it's not this predetermined trajectory based upon your physical geography. So that is the end of lecture for chapter 2, or chapter 1, excuse me. You are now going to move on to your second exercise.